Now, we are joined by Daniel Wild, Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs. Daniel, welcome to Spectator TV.
Thanks for having me on again.
Look, everyone's in a very good mood this week, and so they should be. People were getting a little bit worried that Australia was sleepwalking into the same divisive and toxic race politics as New Zealand and America. But on Saturday, Australia showed that actually we still believe in the narrative of one nation with one voice and one flag and one people. Now, you wrote in your letter to the IPA members, quote, "I have never been prouder to be an Australian than today. The defeat of the Voice to Parliament is a major victory for the Australian way of life and a victory for unity over division. The defeat is total, comprehensive, inarguable and permanent," end quote. Now, Daniel, is this a turning point in Australian politics?
It is a turning point in Australian politics for a number of reasons. Firstly, it reaffirms that the vast majority of Australians agree that our way of life is based on equality, based on everyone being treated the same, and that, as you mentioned before, we're not going to go down the divisive race-based path that some other nations have gone down. It also shows that Australians can see through the elites. This campaign was very unfair and very unequal. As you know, it was the big woke corporations, the major civic institutions, places of worship, sporting codes, many media organisations all supported the Yes case. We know the government gave favourable tax treatment to the Yes case. The government didn't even want to distribute the pamphlet, the Yes and the No pamphlet, to households originally before they were forced to back down on that. So there was a concerted effort by the political class to stop Australians getting information. We also know there was systematic censorship by big tech and self-appointed fact-checkers that were targeting the No campaign. Yet Australians saw through all of that, and they understood that the referendum was about one thing and one thing only, and that was division, racial division, and they rejected that. And so we can take a lot of hope and a lot of confidence that while we have challenges, the foundations of our nation are still very strong, and I think there'll be many, many more victories to come over the coming years.
Well, Anthony Albanese made a critical error. Unlike his authoritarian peers in the other Western nations, he actually asked if Australians would like to come on this journey with him toward extreme left politics, and we, almost alone in the world, had the opportunity to say no. Daniel, how is the Labor Party and the activist class, particularly Indigenous Minister Linda Burney, how are they rationalising the result that showed that the largest no votes came from regional and remote communities, including those with the largest Aboriginal population? It wasn't exactly a redneck victory that the ABC accuses of. Was this a victory for the small voices over that of the bureaucracy?
Yeah, I think it was a victory for mainstream Australians over the elites. And in terms of how are the Yes activists handling this, well, they're in denial. Their main argument has been Australians were deceived by misinformation, that they didn't know what it is that they were voting on. And you would have thought that the Labor Party would be curious as to why 80% of Labor-held electorates voted no. I mean, this is astonishing, and this has never happened before. It's not just a disconnect between the mainstream and the elites. There's a fundamental disconnect within the Labor Party. As you know, the Labor Party is led by the left, yet the voting base of the Labor Party is on the right, and they have thoroughly repudiated the leadership of the Labor Party. That's why they don't want to think about this or talk about it, because it's too difficult for them to understand. And there is now a real big opportunity for the coalition to speak to mainstream Australians and to speak to those Labor voters that are disenfranchised. There are far more no-voting Labor voters than there are yes-voting Teal voters. And the path back to government for the coalition is not through the inner cities, it's clearly through the outer suburbs. And I think we're going to see a rapid decline to Anthony Albanese as leader. And I believe that we're going to see a rapid reshaping of our politics and our culture in this country, which is long overdue.
I think it's fair to say that Australia didn't only say no to the voice proposal, they said no to everything printed on the Prime Minister's T-shirt: treaty, truth-telling and reparations. Considering every state and territory aside from Canberra came back with a resounding no, what do you make of state premiers who are pushing ahead with legally and morally dubious treaties?
Well, you're right, it was a package deal that was put to Australians. It was voice, treaty, truth. The point of the voice was always to have a treaty, because you can't have a treaty with 300 or 400 separate communities or entities. The voice was going to be the counterparty to the treaty, and a part of the treaty process was going to be so-called truth-telling, which means reparations. That was the plan all along, and Australians rejected the whole thing. In terms of the premiers, and also I have to say some opposition leaders as well, who support treaty, they need to get with the program and understand that Australians have had a gutful of racial division. They're well and truly over relitigating history wars. We are a great nation with good people. Like all nations, we have flaws, but we've recognised those flaws and done more than any other nation to do good. And ultimately, we need to move forward as a nation rather than engaging in these continual attacks on our way of life. So I think the premiers need to understand that very clearly. Australians don't want to go down this path anymore. And I'm very hopeful that we will get there. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. But over the coming years, I believe we're going to be able to close the door on what has been a never-ending series of attacks on our way of life by the elites, who I think are finally getting the message, although, it's going to take a lot more work, but I think we're getting there.
Well, Daniel, doesn't the continuation of divisive race politics by the Labor premiers and, as you say, some of the Liberal shadow premiers show that they are not interested in listening to the voice of the people, but rather they were hoping that the voice would be a bureaucratic entity that they could negotiate with and use it to override smaller communities? Because we saw in Victoria already the extremely powerful Aboriginal land councils will do things like approve solar and wind projects and transmissions lines against the wishes of local communities who are being steamrolled over by these big organised bureaucracies. Am I being too cynical, Daniel, or is the virtuous left conscripting sort of race politics to approve commercial projects?
You're probably not being cynical enough, if anything, unfortunately. Look, there's no limit to what the left will do to get their way. That's been a common theme throughout the history of Western civilization, certainly in the history of our country. There's a strand of leftism that's fundamentally illiberal, and they don't like having constitutional or democratic checks and balances on their ambitions. And so they always seek to circumvent that, and you can go through our history and see many instances of that. And then Australians have time and time again said, no, you're going too far, you've got to stay within these boundaries. And that's what's happened again with the voice to Parliament, which is why I'm very hopeful about the future. I just want to make another point. You sort of hinted at this a moment ago, which is, they don't want to think about this. They put it to a vote. And I think that's the last time we're going to have a vote on anything like this for a long time. That's both a good and a bad thing. I think it puts to bed for the time being constitutional radicalism. I don't think we'll see, for example, a vote on the Republic for some time. But it means that the left will just keep going through less transparent means. We've seen that in the ACT, how radical they've been there. For example, with drug decriminalisation, there's been no debate. Where I am in Victoria, we've seen dramatic changes to our way of life, and not in a good way. So, look, the left never stop. I think it's good that we've had a public vote, and we need, on the right, what do we need to do? We need to keep talking about this, because you'll already see in the media, they're already they don't want to talk about it anymore. They've moved on. We need to keep talking about this, because this is a really significant moment in our nation's history, and we need to make sure that the elites understand exactly what this means, because, as I say, we may not get this chance again for many years.
Yes, well, for a Prime Minister that went on and on about listening to the Australian people, he doesn't like what he's heard in reply to his proposal, and they certainly haven't got the message that it's not just no to a voice, it's a no to the renaming of places, it's a no to reparations, it's a big no to native title kicking Australians out of their home, it's a no to Indigenous policies like we saw in Western Australia, where the no vote's so large, I'm sure, in response to that terrible Indigenous heritage laws that we saw having to be repealed. But we we have shocking news this morning. One of Labor's major reasons for demanding the voice referendum was for the protection of children. Now, we saw that they even shamefully dragged out a young Indigenous boy in front of the camera and tried to say he wouldn't have a future unless we all voted yes. Well, Jacinta Price, the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, called for a royal commission into child sexual abuse in remote Indigenous communities. And what did Labor do? They voted it down. A royal commission brings detail, it answers questions, it gets to the heart of what's really going on. It's not a vibe or anything, it's an actionable authority. Is this a shameful day for the Labor Party that they voted this down?
Well, I think it shows that, there was the primary purpose of the voice was not necessarily to address those areas of disadvantage. As you identified before, it was more about setting up a bureaucratic superstructure in Canberra that would be a platform for activists. And look, the issues in remote parts of the country are conceptually not difficult to understand. You need to have jobs, you need to have access to things like healthcare, you need to have crime-free suburbs and communities in order to be able to have a decent life. These basic building blocks are not contingent on the colour of your skin. All Australians need access to those amenities. So the concept of what Australians need in remote areas is not difficult to understand. The practical implementation is very challenging and very difficult. But why you needed another bureaucracy to communicate the basic truths of what it takes to get ahead in life was never clear to the Australian people. And all they saw was more division coming out of Canberra and another bureaucratic proposal. And again, the Prime Minister didn't want to talk about, well, what would this mean in practice? And as you say, I think it's deeply disappointing that the Labor Party have voted against what is a pretty sensible proposition to have a royal commission into child abuse in some of these communities.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. And look, thank you, especially for all the work the IPA has done for this referendum. We were all significantly outnumbered, as you pointed out. We didn't have the backing of big business. We didn't have any private jets to spray paint with our no symbol like the Yes campaign did. Just quickly, what do you think is going to happen to all those corporates who have now discovered that their customers don't agree with them?
Look, unfortunately, I don't think anything's going to happen, to be perfectly honest with you. They're just going to keep going. And we've already seen that. I think it was it might have been the outgoing chairman of Telstra said, we did the right thing. Well, okay, if that's going to be your attitude, fair enough. But what we saw was unprecedented, which was many of these companies, Qantas in particular, were price gouging customers, making rip-off profits, and then funneling that into the government's preferred model for constitutional change. I mean, that's corporatism at its worst. And so these corporates need to understand that if you're going to play that game, then you will lose from time to time, and the credibility in the community and the trust is plummeting rapidly. And so when they ask for something from government or when they want the community to back them in, they'll find that people just aren't there anymore because of what these corporates have done to our country. So again, they need to get with the program, but I don't see any indication of that happening anytime soon.
Well, let's hope the Liberal Party and the National Party are smart enough to realise that the Australian people have given them an in for a way forward through the culture wars. There's a very clear message being sent, and if we can get the Liberals to do away with things like treaties and get on board with the United Australia, well then perhaps we might have a chance to see a return of Conservative government and an end to this divisive socialist politics and Marxist race politics, which has no place in Australia. But thank you, Daniel, for joining us here on Spectator TV.